This video is perhaps the most complicated of all, because in it I will attempt to make sense of a very complicated philosopher by the name of Parmenides. Before we do, let's introduce ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophy. Pre-Socratic means philosophers prior to Socrates. We'll discuss Thales, whose name you see here, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, and Parmenides, who directly influences Socrates. Socrates doesn't write anything himself. Everything we know of Socrates is from people like Plato and others who wrote about him. So Socrates is Plato's teacher, and Plato is Aristotle's teacher. What all of the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers have in common is their considerable insistence on natural explanations for natural phenomena rather than supernatural explanations. So, a number of these philosophers we could think of as elementalists. They want to identify the fundamental elements of reality. So Thales claims that the most fundamental unit of existence is water. There are good reasons to think why. We live on a water planet. Life cannot exist without water. We ourselves are water creatures. If you poke us with a sharp stick, we leak a fluid. And water can exist as a solid, a liquid, or a gas. It's versatile. And so that's Thales' logical candidate for the most fundamental element of reality. Anaximander, Anaximenes, and Anaxagoras all offer different fundamental elements. Anaximander, not especially helpful with his apeiron, or indefinite, as the cause of all things. Anaximenes, with a different element, that air is the most fundamental unit of reality. Again, a natural explanation for the natural world, rather than a supernatural foundation for natural reality. In a chemical sense, we now know that Anaximenes may be presupposing Thales. Think of the molecular composition of water, hydrogen and oxygen, both which by themselves would be gases, or in the ancient elemental terms, air. Perhaps Anaximenes is closer to the truth of the fundamental features of reality. Anaxagoras identifies an ordering principle in matter and believes that this is mind and argues that. And Pythagoras, much like a Newton or one of our physicists much later in history, identifies that everything is mathematics and is able to identify a real and universal truth, which you likely learned at a young age, called the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. The ancient Greeks and their search for natural principles to explain natural phenomena, here and there, leads them to truth. Absolute truth. Truth with it, which is not just what's true for me might not be true for you, but truths which are true for everyone, forever, and always, to the ends of the universe. And that is no small matter. Heraclitus makes the elemental argument that everything is fire and change. Lucretius and Democritus invent the idea of the atom, the uncuttable. We could call them atomists. What Lucretius writes in a text called On the Nature of Things is that everything is merely atoms, little bits of matter. In his words translated into English, swerving in the void. Lucretius doesn't have an answer for why the atoms swerve, but we now do. We explain the curved courses of the atoms due to gravity and electromagnetism. Perhaps among these already, you see the power of ancient Greek pre-Socratic naturalistic explanations in terms of the history and development of ideas. If Heraclitus claims or argues that everything is change, Parmenides provides the opposite argument, that there is no change, that change is an illusion, and that everything is one complete, unified whole. However, things obviously change. How in the world can Parmenides claims that there's no such thing? That is a paradox, and Parmenides provides us with a number of paradoxes. I believe we had defined previously, whether or not we have, let's define again, that a paradox is a statement that seems contradictory, but is supposed to express some insight. It will be difficult to wrap our minds around Parmenides' paradoxes. But in order to determine if he has any wisdom, we'll have to at least try. In the text which I've asked you to read, called Pythagoras' Golden Verses, or the Golden Verses of the Pythagoreans, if you take the time to attempt to deal with it, and it's not especially complicated, you will find two things of incredible importance. First off, a mathematical religion with religious symbolism and religious ethics that are incredibly general or generalized. They're vague religious or ethical concepts that could be found in any religion. Bringing us back to the question we asked when we discussed Confucius. If one is behaving justly and morally, and various religions provide the exact same descriptions of how to do that, does it matter which religion one behaves morally under? Or is one as good as the other if many are articulating very similar themes? Secondly, the golden verses of Pythagoras, in a certain sense, I think, contain the entire history of Western philosophy as a foreshadowing or a preview of coming attractions. Everything from ancient Greek philosophy, which is as clear as day in the golden verses, that of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who were obviously influenced by Pythagoras, to the Renaissance, Christianity, Confucianism, and even late 19th and early 20th century, what we'll call existentialism, exists as if in seed form in the golden verses. And so read the golden verses now as a preview, and perhaps once again at the end of the semester, to wonder at the fact that Pythagoras was able to presuppose 2,000 years of intellectual history. That is no small accomplishment. Heraclitus, most famous for the Greek phrase pantakorei, which means that all things are in change, or that everything is flux, that everything is always changing and nothing remains the same, providing us paradoxical insights, such as the only thing that never changes is that everything is always changing, or that the only thing that remains the same is that nothing ever remains the same. Famous phrases such as, "You cannot step into the same river twice," or that the way up and the way down is one and the same. But our star attraction, in my opinion, for the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, is Parmenides. Parmenides writes a text called On Nature, which he divides into two parts: the way of truth and the way of opinion. According to the way of truth, there is no such thing as change, and according to the way of opinion, there is such thing as change, difference, and the passage of time. So that Parmenides paradoxically argues, time is an illusion. But certainly we experience the passage of time. Therefore, Parmenides must be wrong, right? Perhaps Parmenides might be off his rocker. In order to determine whether or not he is, we'll have to see if he's saying anything that makes sense, or if it's just crazy. The way of truth is exemplified by a simple, logical sentence that, most fundamentally, what is. And that's it. And it should not be confused with what is not, because what is not is not. So Parmenides is setting up a hard and fast guillotine of a division to separate truth from fiction, reality from fantasy, and what is real from what is not real and illusory. To re-emphasize simply, what is. Or perhaps, what exists. What is not. What does not exist does not exist. Although people may try to persuade you to be of the opinion that things that manifestly do not exist do exist. That is precisely the confusion Parmenides is attempting to protect his audience from, being confused about reality and illusion, things that are real from things that are made up. At first, this seems uncontroversial. Its implications are wild and unforgiving. So, buckle in and put your brain into a low gear so that way you can get some traction if you desire to try to follow along with these ancient ideas and to understand how they influence the rest of world history. Parmenides attempts to steer his audience away from the path on which mortals, knowing nothing, wander, two-headed, for helplessness in their breasts guides their wandering minds, and they are carried, deaf and blind alike, dazed, uncritical tribes, for whom being and not being are thought the same and yet not the same. And the path of all runs in opposite directions. Let's not mix up things that exist and things that do not. And let's not suppose that things that do not exist do exist. Keep that firmly in mind as we continue forward. For never shall this be proved, that things that are not are, or that things that do not exist do exist. I'll skip forward. One path only is left for us to speak of. What is? How could what is be in the future? How could it come to be? For if it came to be, it is not. Nor is it, if at some time it is going to be. Thus, coming to be is extinguished and perishing unheard of. What Parmenides is attempting to do is use language and logic to do away with the concept of becoming or coming into existence, and even perishing in favor of pure being. I think what Parmenides has in mind is perhaps a four-dimensional vision of time, We perceive time sequentially, one moment after the next, after the next, after the next. Parmenides appears to be arguing that that itself is our particular illusion spawned by our particular human existence and its epistemological condition. Imagine seeing in a single glance a person's birth, life, and death stretched out in front of you, like mile markers on a highway can be seen from a distance. Imagine standing on a hillside and looking out at a lonely highway. You could see, as you pass your gaze from left to right, and take in a single vision the miles, the mile markers, the dashes on the road, the yards, the feet, the inches, all of which make up that stretch of highway. In a single image, you can then infer what it might be like to see time from that perspective, not as sequentially unfolding, but a universe as a collection of individual moments, seen not individually, but all at once as a whole. That is the monism which Parmenides likely has in mind. Certainly, though, we see change. We see becoming and passing away. We see groups of atoms move from here to there. You can hold your hand up and move it across from left to right. So how is it that Parmenides can claim that there is no change? There is no motion? Surely he's lost his mind, right? Maybe, but maybe not. Consider a single atom existing at the tip of your fingernail. You can wave that atom back and forth, and it moves, right? Imagine if you could see the entire life history of that atom, in the same way we saw the mile markers on the highway stretched out as if from a distance. One road made up of many inches and feet. One atom made up of different places in time which it sequentially occupies. From our perspective, the atom is moving. From a dimensional perspective, 1 degree higher than we perceive the universe, we could see not only one atom's life history from the beginning of the universe to the end as a complicated vector or line through space, but all atoms in all of their directions, everywhere they go, from the moment of creation until the end of all things. That is likely the image that Parmenides has in mind. As we'll see momentarily, Parmenides we might call a materialist, in a different sense than we had used previously. His philosophy is that material things, and especially the atoms which make them up, do absolutely exist. But this provides us with two implications. I'll address those momentarily because they are mind-boggling. Parmenides' philosophy could be called a materialist epistemology, because what we can know is things about physical stuff, the stuff that really does exist. Or as a type of empiricism, or materialistic empiricism. We'll define empiricism even more specifically in the next set of videos. The one after that, technically, when we deal with Plato and Aristotle. For our purposes now, empiricism deals with gaining knowledge from observation of the material world. Because Parmenides is fiercely separating material things that do indeed truly exist from anything which does not exist. Parmenides is laying down the foundation not only of the later philosophy provided by Socrates and Plato, but also Aristotle, who might be considered the great-grandfather of Western empirical science, and in even more grandiose terms, the entirety of Western science, from Parmenides' time to our own. Parmenides and his epistemology provides an unforgiving empiricism. And I know that's a lot of vocabulary, in which the only thing that is important, the only thing that matters, the only thing that we can have any knowledge about is stuff that exists materially. That we should ignore non-physical stuff because we can't know anything about it, and it likely is fictional anyways. And instead, focus our quest for knowledge on the physical world. And that is the basis of all Western science and every advancement, improvement, and bit of intellectual knowledge it provides. I cannot stress how important that is to the world we all share today and all of its technological wonders and miracles. This is the foundation. Don't confuse things that exist with things that don't exist. More on that in just a moment. For now, the two implications I mentioned. One implication of time existing absolutely is that each moment is eternal. Every moment simply is. And reality and our universe is the entire set collection, aggregated of all those individual moments, all existing like one vast mosaic. If every moment is absolutely, this means that once something has happened, nothing can change it. The past, therefore, is absolute, which means that it's so very important that we do things right the first time, because there can be no going back. Once something has happened, that is the way it will have happened for all of eternity. It simply is. No one can change the fact that slavery existed in the United States of America for hundreds of years. That is. We can whitewash it. We can try and explain it away. We can ignore it. But it is. That just is a feature of the universe. Nothing can change the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. That just is. Or if, for example, you have too much to drink at a bar one night, get in your car, and wind up killing someone on the road, that simply is. Nothing can change that. From here until the end of eternity, nothing changes that event. It simply is. And nothing makes it go away. This allows us to transition to the second important implication, that Parmenides had claimed there's no such thing as becoming, no such thing as perishing. But we come into existence, we're born, we grow up, and eventually we die. We perish. This would disprove Parmenides' philosophy, right? Not so fast. If we understand Parmenides, we might understand that we ourselves are an illusion. What exists is the atoms that make us up. We are like the mist, here today, gone tomorrow. A later philosopher will refer to a similar idea as a category mistake. The story goes that a student went to visit a university, and as he's taking a tour around the university, he asks to be shown the library, the student union, the administrative building, the dorms. And after being shown all those parts of campus, he asks, "Now show me the university. I want to see the university." And the tour guide says, "Well, I did. Here's the library. Here are the dorms. Here's the administration building." And the student says, "I see all the individual buildings. Where's the university?" The student has made a category mistake. All those little bits make up the university. But the university is an idea. It doesn't exist as something separate and independent, something standalone. It's the conglomeration of all those little parts. Buddhism, as well as a Renaissance philosopher by the name of David Hume, provides similar ideas that Parmenides might provide here in understanding the human person. That we, too, are a sort of category mistake. All the little bits and pieces that make us up exist. We ourselves are just the momentary combination of those pieces. Impermanent, as Buddhism allowed us to understand. So that if you take out a gun and shoot someone, or hit them with your car and kill them, in one sense, someone has perished. But in another sense, all those atoms that made up the person are still there. They have not vanished from existence. But they're there in a different placement in relationship to one another. They're now on separate paths. Parmenides will allow us, again in a moment, to comprehend even deeper and further the implications of this monistic philosophy. So let's move on so we can wrap it up. In a word, we might say that we are fictions, we people, we humans, as individual, separate, living organisms. We're a fiction, but a useful fiction, an important one. The same concept will recur in a moment. For now, look at 8b. Parmenides writes, "It is the same thing to think of something, and to think that it is or it exists, since you will never find thought without what is, to which it refers, and on which it depends." The rest after that is flourish. What Parmenides is arguing is that we can only think in terms of things that exist. For example, tell me if you can imagine a color of the rainbow that does not exist, has never been seen before, and is not any combination of any other colors of the rainbow. My guess is that it's impossible to visualize a never-before-seen color of the rainbow. But think now of a centaur. You can form an image quite easily of that. Half horse, half human. But centaurs do not exist. Yet we can think of them. We can only think of them because we are combining things that do exist into a fiction of something that does not exist. A centaur is mythological and not reality. People exist, horses exist, but half horse, half people are not. In terms of things either existing or not existing, they do not. A centaur is a chimera. A chimera is a general term for a combination animal. The Sphinx, or Griffin, or Medusa. These are all chimeras. Combinations of things that do exist into things that do not. Into things that are fiction that are not reality. They are not real. They're illusions, imaginations, fantasy, mythology. When we understand the implication of line 8b, we see just how radical Parmenides' philosophy is, as well as to what extent it forms the foundation of all Western empirical science. Consider, for example, an angel. The image that people often have is a person with wings. In the context of Parmenides' materialist empirical philosophy, separating things that are from things that are not, while a person does exist, and wings do exist, a person with wings is a fantasy. This line of argument extends further. Think of a heaven, an eternal place in the sky with streets of gold and mansions and perfect happiness forever. We can form that image in the same way we can imagine a centaur. But to follow Parmenides' philosophy, the division between what is and what is not is uncompromising. While streets exist and the sky exists, and gold exists and mansions exists, a place in the sky with streets of gold and mansions is a fiction, mythology. It's not real. At least according to the particular philosophy of Parmenides, which is materialist and empirical. The only things that exist are things that exist. Things that do not exist do not exist. Take, for example, if I ask you, how many angels and demons are in the room with you right now? If you say 1 or 100 or 1,000, and I ask you, point them out, and you say, well, they're here, but they're not here. That is a confusion. That is an intellectual mistake from Parmenides' perspective. That either they are or they are not. No confusion among the two. The same would apply to a person who has died. We already discussed the paradoxes of death in terms of Parmenides. But if we say that people who are not alive are actually also alive in a separate dimension, we have confused what is with what is not. Either it is or it is not. No overlap is allowed between those two. The same would apply to the gods themselves. That either they manifestly and materially are, or they are not. If I ask you, is there a God? And then say, point it out. And you say, it's here, but it's not here. For Parmenides' logic, that would be illogical and irrational. Now, Parmenides could be wrong. We could disagree with him. His arguments and logic could be faulty. We could ignore this and pretend it never happened. But Parmenides is asking his audience to focus not on invisible spirits and how to please them. Things that, by all intents and purposes, appear not to be. And instead, to focus on what is. The real things that exist in the real physical world. By Parmenides' logic provided in line 8b, God himself, if it even makes sense to speak of the God as masculine, would be a chimera, like the centaur or the sphinx. A combination of things that really do exist into something that is pure mythology, fiction, fantasy, illusion, or imagination. I provide you for this now. I provide this for you now. Not to be mean, not to upset, but to accurately understand Parmenides' philosophy, what makes it materialistic and empirical, and to understand why philosophy takes the turn that it does, not only in Plato and Epicurus, who are similarly unforgiving to religious ideologies, but in the 1800s to Nietzsche, who is absolutely antagonistic to what he claims is a laughable idea that there is a God. How does philosophy get to that point? By individual steps, one after the other. You can ignore them. You can disagree with them. You can critique them. And it's only one of two sides of a complicated discussion, thousands of years in the making. But just as Socrates argues, either there is or is not an afterlife, and that statement is true, the following one is also true. Either there is such a thing as a God, or there's not. And that is a true statement. Or at least, I am philosophically defending the argument that that is a true statement. God, from the perspective of Parmenides' philosophy, would be a chimera. If, for example, we define God as all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving. Power really does exist in the physical world. Knowledge really does exist in the physical world. Love, even, really does exist in the physical world. An all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving being who exists in the sky forever? if we understand Parmenides' logic in line 8b of the text on nature, God is not. And that's as revolutionary as it comes. There is one other paradox, which is that in the opening lines of the text, Parmenides appeals to spirits and deities. What sense can we make of this paradox? Many people have argued, many scholars have argued, that it's customary in terms of his style and the style of his day to open in such a way. Or perhaps Parmenides is protecting himself from uncharitable readers who might not grasp the revolutionary fire of line 8b. I'll leave you to wrestle with those. For now, let's finish out. In the way of subjectivity, the way of opinion, Parmenides starts by writing, "Wherever I begin, it is all one to me, for there I shall return again." As if saying, it doesn't matter what I say here. It's all made up anyways. He continues, "Here I stop my trustworthy speech to you, and thought about objective truth. From here on, learn the subjective beliefs of mortals. Listen to the deceptive orderings of my words. For they made up their minds to name two forms, one of which it is not right to name at all, and here is where they have gone astray, and have distinguished them as opposite in bodily form, and have assigned to them marks distinguishing them one from another. Number 1. Here, on the one hand, ethereal flame of fire, gentle, very light, everywhere the same as itself. Let's pause there and understand number 1. Parmenides is claiming that people say there's two things, number 1 and number 2. His claim is that only the first one is real, the second one is inaccurate to speak of. And, by extension, not real. So that, like Heraclitus, everything is fire, everything is light, everywhere is the same. But Heraclitus had instead used that element to argue that everything is change and nothing is the same. How do we make sense of this difference? What you're looking at on the top of this photograph are individual atoms. At the bottom you see a ball and stick model. These vertices, at each one, is an individual carbon atom. And disappearing off here are individual hydrogen atoms. A few years ago, scientists at IBM were able to take some of the first photographs of individual atoms. And what you see likely expresses Parmenides, perhaps also Heraclitus's fundamental element of existence. That these atoms, if we understand Einstein's formula of E equals mc squared. The implication is that matter is energy. There's actually no such thing as physical matter. Everything in existence is nothing more than energy in motion. That those vertices are just little bits of lightning bound up upon themselves. And from here to the farthest reaches of the universe, every bit of what we call matter is that lightning encircled upon itself. Parmenides continues with number 2, which he says is what is not. He says it's not the same as this other, which in itself is opposite, dark night, a dense and heavy body. There's a common dualism in philosophy between the body and very often the soul. If we apply that dualism to Parmenides' rejection of dualism in favor of monism, we likely are left with the idea that for Parmenides, if the body, for the reasons we just identified, is illusion and not real, then all we're left with is a soul made of fire, energy, or light, or spirit being, as sometimes people put it. That's what we are. Energy bound up upon itself. But this soul is not the soul of the religions you're familiar with. Instead, this soul is the physical flesh and blood, as we call it, bone and sinew. That our body is energy, but it's not immortal. So that for Parmenides, we might be able to reason that we are all soul and no body, and that what we call body is in fact our soul, but that it is a mortal soul and not immortal, because of the arguments we had given previously, that what we are is this combination of little bits that's here today, very fragile, and gone tomorrow. We'll end with Parmenides this way. He says, "All this order I present to you as probable, so that no mortal belief shall ever outdo you. But since all things have been named light and night, and their powers have been assigned to each, all is a plenum of light and obscure night." Plenum means a multitude or mixture. "Together, both equal, since nothingness partakes in neither." Consider when people talk about the powers of light and the powers of darkness. Perhaps all Parmenides means is the power to show, the power to warm, the power to hide, the power to cool. But when people talk about the powers of darkness, often they mean something supernatural, evil, invisible spirits that are both not here, but also here for insidious purposes. What we understood earlier is that for Parmenides, it either is or it isn't. And so, if such things apparently are not, then they are not. But perhaps Parmenides is arguing, in his monism and rejection of dualism, that only the light exists, and that there's no such thing as the powers of darkness, and that in moral terms, there is only good, and yet no such thing as evil. There's a complex argument that could be made to support that idea. But for your benefit and mine, I'll leave that one off, and instead suggest that perhaps for Parmenides, morality itself, good and bad, right and wrong, just and evil, are also fictions. They're inventions. To wrap up what we had started, if we ourselves were useful fictions, so too might morality be. In the early Renaissance, a radical and revolutionary author named Niccolo Machiavelli will make precisely that argument, that morality is made up. It's not real, and only truly important to appear to be moral. What you do when no one's looking, much more the better for you. That's a very dangerous argument. For Parmenides, he's likely right. Morality very likely is a human invention. There are well-known arguments to the contrary. But Friedrich Nietzsche will make a similar argument, that it was people who invented moral codes in the ancient world, and thus for people to reinvent them when they outlived their usefulness in the modern world. Every single one of these is a complex and fraught with difficulty set of challenging questions. But that's what it is to do philosophy. To engage to the best of our ability with the challenging questions. Which, if you'll permit me and yourself, we will continue to do.